I'm Greg Dalton.
I'm Ariana Brocious.
And this is Climate One. It's the beginning of summer, and that means people around the world are on the lookout for wildfires.
Right. This is one of the most devastating effects of the climate crisis. These incredibly intense wildfires that wipe out whole communities and transform the skies over big parts of the country. We've all seen the harrowing pictures and videos in the news, and honestly, often it can look apocalyptic. And whether you live in fire country or not, it's almost impossible to escape the smoke, which is terrible for our health and our kids' health.
Right here in the Bay Area, we've inhaled smoke from fires hundreds of miles away. And wherever the smoke originates, breathing it in is disgusting. And of course, in the actual paths of these fires, people lose homes and even their lives.
For most of the 20th century, the messaging was, all fires are bad fires. Let's put them out. I grew up with Smokey the Bear.
Yeah, me too.
And Smokey has been around for decades. But here's a particularly catchy version of his message from the height of the boy band era.
So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches, don't play with fire. Yeah.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
That's a lot hipper than the Smokey I remember, but...
Only you, Greg, only you can prevent forest fires. Yeah, and he's still around, right? I have a billboard of him in my city right now. And he's not wrong. You know, this message of being careful when you're out in the wilderness or in the forests with your matches and setting sparks, that's important. It's still true. We do not want the general public to inadvertently start fires. But in the last couple decades, the way we understand and manage wildfires has started to change.
Right, and this is a really big, slow shift. So on the show today, we're going to hear from forestry and public lands experts who are re-examining our relationship with wildfire and some people whose lives have been transformed by those fires. Susan Prichard has lived through several record-setting wildfire seasons in eastern Washington. She's a fire ecologist and research scientist at the University of Washington. She researches how fire and climate disruption shapes forest dynamics and how tools like thinning and purposeful burning can make wildfires and their smoke less severe. Given everything she knows about wildfires, I asked her why she chooses to live where she does.
One of the things that I really appreciated about living here is that it's fire country. What a better place to live and recreate for a fire ecologist than fire country. I also was very aware that the Meto people preceded me for over 10,000 years and regularly burned this valley. This is a valley of fire, and part of that fire is maintenance burning by Indigenous people. And so the smoke jumper base started in 1940, but that was long after the Meto people had been tragically killed by diseases and displaced from this landscape.
You mentioned the largest fire of your career happened. Can you tell me which fire and what year was that?
So the first largest fire of my career was the 2006 Tripod Complex fire. And at the time, I thought, as did my colleagues, that it would be the fire that I would study for years that would not be exceeded. And it was around 175,000 acres. And so when the tripod started burning, honestly, I was a little bit giddy because I saw this smoke plume that went up about 30,000 feet in the air. It was very dramatic. And what surprised me the most was how unlivable it was to endure a wildfire once that smoke column collapsed and smoked out our valley, and lasted for a good 2.5 months as that fire marched its way to the Canadian border.
So giddy because as a fire ecologist, you're excited it's something big you can study. And I vividly remember living in the Bay Area around 2017 when wildfire moved into urban areas, and I breathed what I thought were climate impacts into my lungs for the first time. And it's very traumatic and stressful. I can't imagine what it was going like for you for 2 months to go through that, even as a fire ecologist.
With young kids, it became very real, very fast, because they had developing lungs and wanted to be outside. We reflected that as a family, we were very lucky because my parents live on the west side of the mountains and we were able to escape. But it was troubling to me, even in that first big fire event, that many people couldn't afford to take that time off work and get out of it and had to endure this fire for a very long time.
Now there's research around the practice of letting these fires burn, beneficial fires. We think about them differently rather than putting them out immediately. So how are fire managers responding to this after nearly a century of stomping out every fire?
There is a great awareness amongst fire managers and also, I think, increasingly the public that these beneficial fires that we talk about, so prescribed fires that happen under a prescription window of favorable weather and atmospheric conditions so that the fires will probably not escape and probably not smoke out communities. People understand the importance of prescribed burning as well as supporting revitalization of cultural burning practices by Indigenous peoples. Actually getting it to be on the ground is so much harder of a hurdle.
Yep, because there's lots of issues that come up with beneficial fire, right? Oh, like people don't like to smell smoke on a sunny day, or they don't like to see the charred landscape because in their beautiful rural area, and people think about risk. What if it gets out of control? Why would you start a fire on purpose, right? Fires are bad. We put them out.
Exactly. I attended a talk not very long ago where the ecologist was asking the question, why do we always refer to fire as a disturbance or as a catastrophe? When we think about rain, sometimes we think about rain as either just a rainfall and necessary for our gardens to grow, or it can turn into a massive flood. And so on one end of the spectrum, rain is a disturbance, and the other one is just rain. Same thing with wind. Oh, it's a windy day. But then we have hurricanes. Why doesn't fire get allowed to just be fire sometimes and be beneficial?
Fire gets a bad rap, perhaps. Can you give us an example of a place where beneficial fire is more accepted and used to good effect?
Absolutely. So we see it actually locally. Where I live, there are some beautiful stands of ponderosa pine with grassy understories, and they're not by chance. So the Forest Service has committed to going in and regularly thinning these forests and then burning underneath the trees. And the pines have gotten so beautiful. They're more like stately pine savannas with an understory that is really difficult to imagine that a wildfire could come back in and kill those pines because the pines have a lot of elbow room and the grasses underneath are not necessarily going to be lethal to them if they burn. What I've noticed over the last, especially 5 years, is a growing awareness by the public that if it's not a matter of if anymore, it's a matter of when fires return, and that we as the public can support some beneficial burning so that hopefully when wildfires occur, they're not as bad, not as damaging to communities. So I think that that acceptance of some smoke is something people are reckoning with. So the example that I can show is I've been working with Fort Stewart Army installation in Georgia, and they actually had a pretty bad wildfire problem back in the 1980s. So much like in the West, there had been quite a bit of fire suppression. And so these forests had grown up and become more flammable and in ways that weren't great for military operations. And so some bombing installations actually accidentally hit wildfires or lightning strikes would happen. And then they had a situation on their hands. And so managers started doing thinning and especially a lot of burning. At this point on the reservation, they actually burn a third of their area every single year. So these
Wow,
pine forests,
that's quite a lot. Okay.
it's hard
So
for us to even imagine. So these pine forests need regular burning. And so at this point, they brought back regular burning, and longleaf pine ecosystems are quite rare in the southeastern United States, even though they used to be the predominant pine forest. And they support an endangered species, the red cockaded woodpecker. So as the military installation has invested back into beneficial burning, it's been much better for their installation because they now, when they get an unplanned wildfire, it's not a big deal. They've got their fuels under control. But it's also a win for fire-dependent ecosystems and that red
right.
cockaded woodpecker.
So that seems like the cultural acceptance supports a practice that's good for the ecosystem, good for the military, prevents big harm in the future. But these intentional or beneficial fires do emit carbon emissions, right? So how do you weigh the carbon impact of this by starting more fires now?
That's such a good question. I wanted to also say that all fires produce smoke, and smoke's not good for us. That is a truth. And so even in Georgia with these frequent burns, the burns are done under prescription. So the day would have to be a day where the ventilation, so the atmospheric conditions were good to vent, hopefully, that smoke up and out rather than smoking out communities. We also now are looking for forests as part of a solution to too much carbon dioxide and too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Fire produces carbon dioxide and methane, amongst other carbon, into the atmosphere. So what are the trade-offs there? I think that that's a really difficult question, because if we had a magic wand, perhaps we'd wave it and allow forests to become dense and store as much carbon as possible, especially in this really critical time.
Right.
But I think that the question about can we do that has already been answered. The answer is no. We cannot actually stop wildfires from happening. And so beneficial fires, this regular maintenance burning, actually ensures that when a wildfire occurs, less fuel is available. And so a really salient point for carbon is that if you've reduced your understory fuels, you're much less likely to get a crown fire. So ideally, you get to a point where in a pine ecosystem, whether that's a southern pine or a western pine ecosystem, you have reduced fuels. And when a wildfire occurs, it doesn't actually kill very many trees. And so you get to keep those awesome carbon sequestering trees on the landscape.
Right. So we might be tempted to sort of, grow as much vegetation as possible. That's soaking up carbon dioxide. That's a carbon store. But then someday that becomes a carbon bomb when it all burns. So Washington State experienced a huge Carlton complex fire in 2014 and then a massive wildfire season in 2015. What are the climate fingerprints on those fires? People might, like me, look at that and say, there's climate change. Do we know that?
It used to be that I would actually caution journalists from saying any one wildfire season was an indication of climate change.
Right.
At this point, we can safely say that since the 1990s, we have so much longer and drier of wildfire seasons that these large record-breaking wildfire seasons are a climate signal. There's no question at this point. So when we look back to 2014, which was devastating for my community, and 2015, which was devastating for our neighboring communities, there's no question that those were fueled partly from fire exclusion, loss of fire, but hugely also from drying and warming conditions.
Right. So now we can say this is climate change because the probability is so overwhelming. The science has advanced, partly because of observed measurements and partly because of modeling. We hear a lot about climate models. There's also fire models, and Reburn is a new modeling tool developed by you and others that allows you to simulate wildfire dynamics. So tell us about that and what you're learning from that new Reburn model.
We're inspired to create this model because in simulation space, in modeling space, we can be as brave as we want. And so really with the Reburn model, we wanted to ask the question, what if? What if we allowed for more fire on these landscapes? Could there be actually a negative feedback to future fires? And what I mean by a negative feedback is once you have a fire, such as the Tripod fire or the 2014 Carlton complex fire, another fire that occurs will actually bump into that previous fire for some time. So in my landscapes, it's about 10 years that past wildfires are an absolute barrier to subsequent fire spread. And then after that, they have less fuel on the ground for the most part. And so the very nature of fire reburning a previous fire is different. And so we call that a negative feedback. What we know from research is that once you have enough, a critical mass of either prescribed fires or wildfires on a landscape, they start limiting the size and severity of subsequent fires. So our reburn model explores that in a very brave space where we can say, let's let all the fires burn and see what happens.
That's a radical idea.
Yeah. And we wouldn't want to necessarily do that where people have homes, and it would be too hard. So we also have scenarios where we think about, could we be brave and allow late season wildfires, like ones that happen from lightning or even intentional burning, to burn pretty big because we know that snow and rain is just around the corner. So our model allows us to explore that too. What we found is that the patchwork mosaic of different times of burning and different forest ages, non-forest, such as grasslands and shrublands, all contribute to less fire in terms of overall area, or maybe more importantly, less severe fires. So we might still get some larger fire events, but they don't burn as severely, and a lot more trees survive those fires over time.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way nature works, a little bit here, a little bit there, rather than our kind of human mentality of doing the same thing across in straight lines. Fighting fires has always been dangerous, but with the explosive growth of fire tornadoes and fire weather and these new fire terms that we're starting to learn under the current climate crisis, things are more unpredictable. So how are fire managers responding to protecting human lives and property in that scenario?
I might be a little biased just because I talk with a lot of people about the need for fire. And so I don't want to speak for all fire managers here. But from my conversations with fire managers, there's this reckoning of, wow, we are definitely moving into this new era where almost every summer in some locations, there's that high likelihood of wildfire events. So we need to fight fire way in advance of the fire season. And so that pragmatism is definitely on people's mind, and frustration that even though we know we need more beneficial fire so that wildfires are not as severe, perhaps not as large, we're not doing enough work. And so right now in the fire management community, we're having a lot of those conversations. How do we increase pace and scale of treatment to meet this challenge?
There's an insurance crisis in the West where insurance underwriters are stopping to cover homes in wildfire areas. And should we ask firefighters to defend properties that insurance companies will no longer underwrite? How do we manage that property aspect?
Well, I have a very personal feeling about this, which is that last summer, we were dropped from our insurer that had insured me ever since I was a little kid. For me, that underscored the importance of insurance companies starting to think more locally. I don't think it's very productive for me as a client to have them drop what is a very fire-maintained property. We've done our work around our property.
Yeah, if anyone knows how to protect their house, I think a fire researcher would know. You would know.
Exactly. And so I hope that states actually get involved and work with insurance companies to have better tools to ensure people that are doing the work around their homes, home hardening and landscaping really works. And so that's my hope is that insurance companies will find a way to be profitable and encourage homeowners to actually do the work around their homes and enable them to do it with maybe some cost share.
Right. And to have insurance companies acknowledge that so you get some benefit for that defensible space, that sort of thing, which Absolutely. I have around my home as well. Susan Prichard is a fire ecologist with the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington. Susan Prichard, thank you so much for sharing your insights and a new relationship with fire.
Excellent. Thank you.
Today on the show, we're talking about wildfires, the way their destructive power transforms our landscapes and upends our lives. Coming up, when the fire threatens to consume your personal history.
just walking around the property and just looking around, almost like it was somebody, like someone you loved at the hospital, and you really hope they're going to pull through. But just in case they don't, you give them one more loving look, and you tell them one more time just how much they mean to you.
We'll be right back. Hey, before we get back to the show, we want to tell you about another podcast that we're listening to that we think you'll enjoy.
It's called Political Climate from Latitude Media and Boundary Stone Partners, and it features an insider's view on climate policy and politics.
As you know, clean energy and climate tech are inherently policy-driven enterprises, and anyone working in policy or advocacy has the potential to shape our energy future in a meaningful way. That's what Political Climate is all about. I've listened to it for a while, and I'm excited it's back. Every other week, co-hosts Julia Piper, Emily Domenech, and Brandon Hurlbut cover the nuances of government funding, regulations, backroom negotiations, and of course, the election.
Political Climate is a show for people who want authentic conversations and strong opinions on significant climate issues from voices across the political spectrum. You can listen at latitudemedia.com or anywhere you get your podcasts.
This is Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton. The damage caused by wildfires can be overwhelming. When we hear about the aftermath, it's often as a string of statistics on the evening news or pictures of dramatic orange and red skies, a Mad Max scene. But those don't fully communicate how these fires impact real people. Ana Alanis is a climate justice advocate and founder of Hungry for Climate Action. In 2021, her childhood home in Coffee Creek, California, was threatened by a nearby wildfire. She remembers visiting the house as evacuation orders started to go out. She didn't realize it would be for the last time.
It felt surreal driving up to Coffee Creek. It looked normal until you got closer. I'm trying to think now. A lot of it is blocked out, but the air quality was horrible. It was off the charts. I think it maxed out at 400 on the AQI on my app.
Yeesh, yeah, I've seen that.
And it just felt surreal. Like it felt performative. Like it was hard to get your head around the fact that you were actually needing to do this. Does that make sense?
You didn't think that your house would really burn down?
No. Like the possibility of it, of course, was very real. And I had enough sleepless nights at that point to back up and add credibility to the fact that I knew this was a real threat. Coffee Creek Road, where my parents live, is one road in and one road out. And I had come up with all of these harebrained schemes in case a fire came to keep my parents alive. I did serious research into building an underground bunker or I thought, like, could they dive in the water and survive with towels or straws? And you read these horrible stories. And yeah, so I knew it was real. And I don't know if it was my brain's protective measure, but actually driving up, it felt like make-believe. We got there, and my dad is always in good spirits, so that was also made it feel even more funny. I remember if I were to see a picture of myself then, I looked normal, but I know that I wasn't okay. And I was just kind of this disheveled person going around my house, texting my sisters, asking what they wanted to save. My sisters also didn't think it was real because she only asked to save her Halloween costumes in her high school yearbooks. After the fire, she wished she'd saved different things. It was just too hard to get your head around it.
So you pack up a rental car with your belongings and you get out, and then what happens next?
So we left Coffee Creek. I do remember looking around, leading up to the fire, just walking around the property and just looking around, almost like it was somebody, someone you loved at the hospital, and you really hope they're going to pull through. But just in case they don't, you give them one more loving look,
Mm-hmm.
and you tell them one more time just how much they mean to you. So
you kind of knew that you come back to that, it might be very different. You might be really losing something.
yeah.
Must have been hard. And then you get down and you get safe. And then someone went to your home, went under the police tape or the fire perimeter. And what did she say?
She said it was gone. She said it was gone. I left and my dad stayed, and it was a couple days later. And at this point, I was 150 miles away. I had left Coffee Creek area, and we got a call from a neighbor up the road first who let us know that the fire was coming. So there was also the terror of not knowing if Marco, my stepfather, was safe and out, as well as the rest of our neighbors, and connected with Janelle and my dad later. They let us know that they'd been out, and it was the following day when they were able to get under the police line and confirm that it was gone.
Alanis and her family escaped the fire unharmed physically, but she says she's still recovering from losing her childhood home. We'll hear more of her story on next week's show.
Wildfires can be a massively destructive force, and in a climate-primed landscape with dry soil and hot temperatures, it's one that can get out of control very quickly. But wildfires are a natural process, one that often rejuvenates forests. In fact, many species depend on fire for some aspect of their habitat or food supply. And as we've been relearning in recent years, fire is actually necessary to maintain a healthy ecosystem. Nick Mott is a multimedia journalist and author of This is Wildfire: How to Protect Yourself, Your Home, and Your Community in the Age of Heat. We talked about ways individuals and communities can help make their homes more fire safe. A few decades ago, Forest Service researcher Jack Cohen discovered something surprising that changed the way we think about protecting homes from wildfires. Can you share that story?
Yeah, so Jack's discovery has to do with how and why homes burn and where the real source of the problem is. And, think about a campfire or even a fire in your fireplace. Like, you see that fire burning on a log, you throw another log on and that log burns. And when we think about homes burning, it's intuitive to think that, this big wall of flame, like the wall coming off of this log, say, would burn up against a home and engulf things. And that's how fire spreads. But back when Jack was studying this, fires in communities were a really new thing. Nobody quite knew what was the instigating force, what was causing homes to burn. So he set out to find out. And it turned out that it wasn't just this wall of flame engulfing homes. Instead, to return to the campfire analogy, at the same time that we have this sort of big flame, we have these little sparks and embers shooting off the fire. And, huge wildfires, those embers are big. They loft for miles. And in fact, it's actually the embers that loft away, often in the wind, often for, 1 or 2 or even 5 miles, depending on the weather, and can land in trees, in communities, on homes, on wooden roofs, on wooden decks, and cause homes to ignite. So to Jack, it's a home ignition problem. It's a problem here where we live, not a problem out there in forests. And that just totally shifts the focus of what we can do to get ourselves out of the problem to our own communities instead of forests.
That's so interesting because I think there are other researchers now who are really coming to a similar realization or in some cases advocating for letting fires burn when they're far away from people and structures, right? For the benefits it can have on the landscape and in reducing future fires, perhaps. But also just understanding that we can't control all of the fires, right? And so this idea that really the best thing to protect are the homes, the places we live, and that there's a lot you can do there. And to your point, this expands the idea of what we think of as fire-prone areas or places that have fire risk. So there are a lot more people now who are at risk for wildfire, and they may or may not know it.
Absolutely. I mean, the area where people live that is fire prone, that is at risk of burning, is called a very clunky acronym, the WUI, or Wildland Urban Interface. More than a third of the country is in the WUI. And, tens of millions of homes and families are there. And it's an area that's growing, both because of cost of living. People are pushed out of city centers into more sprawling areas because of demand for aesthetics. It's these beautiful forested places at times. And it's where so much new construction is happening. And at the same time, we have a changing climate, meaning more areas of the country are hotter and drier and more prone to burn. So we're really making things a lot worse for ourselves by where we're choosing to build.
Yeah, and this is something I think about a lot. And it can be easy to kind of assume these are beautiful multi-million-dollar homes. The people who own them have lots of resources at their disposal. But that's not always the case, right? As you mentioned, there's a lot of expansion just because people need places to live.
I mean, yeah, one of the major crises we're facing across the country today is cost of living. And in many parts of the West, there's a saying, drive till you can afford. It's really expensive to live in a city center, even the city periphery. But if you keep driving, often on these unpaved roads out into the forest where it's hard to get in and out of, you can afford things a little better. Often there's not the same zoning and codes and regulation. And that means that while things are more affordable, they're also a lot more dangerous. And so people are pushed that way rather than being just pulled that way by the aesthetic beauty. And there certainly are, wealthy folks living in silly places for aesthetic reasons, but that's not all that's going on.
Right. I'd like you to read us a quote from your book that I found especially resonant.
Many homeowners simply expect the Forest Service or local fire department to come to the rescue whenever they need it. A century of fire suppression built this expectation. People think managing wildfires is someone else's job, a service the government provides.
So how do we need to rethink the balance of responsibility in this current moment in terms of who will protect your home, who should protect your home?
We need to think about ourselves as protecting our homes, and not just ourselves as individuals, but ourselves as community members. So think about you and where you live, but also your neighbors and your larger community outside of, your block. And when I say think about yourselves, the great place to start is at your own home. And that can mean all kinds of work that can get done. Everything from cleaning out your gutters of leaves and pine needles to working on fire-resistant gardening practices that can help keep fire from coming up against your house if it comes from far away. And then if you look bigger, I live in a fairly dense place. Like my neighbor's not very far away on either side. So if I have a fire-resistant yard, my neighbor doesn't, their house is 20 yards or less away, that's not going to make a huge difference if their house goes up in flames, because that residual heat and all those embers can still would easily ignite mine. So it's not just this problem that's purely individual. It's a problem where we have to look a little bigger and connect with our neighbors and offer a helping hand at times, offer tools, offer ideas, and sort of build those links that I think we're missing in a lot of ways from the individual to the more collective.
Mm-hmm. What's the role of zoning here, particularly when we're seeing insurance companies dropping policies left and right for fire risk? I mean, how do we encourage people to build safely in the right places?
Yeah, zoning is a really complicated and controversial topic pretty much everywhere in the West. So zoning can make a massive difference in our risk. There's almost nowhere we can say in the U.S. has said, don't build here because of fire risk. Maybe that's something that communities need to start legislating. But there are a lot of examples of places that say new developments must have done this work, or do not build on this steep slope, or policies that encourage preserving agricultural space that can serve as a buffer. There's a lot of things that can be done zoning-wise, and that can be a really good thing in terms of decreasing overall risk, but also it's hard to make work without also providing incentives, because not everybody has the resources to do the work that's necessary. So I think when we think about these sort of more policy level solutions, zoning and codes are one of them, and there's a big uphill battle there to change mindsets around those things, but also we need to find funding structures to help everybody get on board and help everybody do this work, not just those that already have the resources to do it.
Right. So in the book, you have some really great resources that detail what are the things people can do to protect their home. And I'd like to just walk through a few of those now. So the home ignition zone, let's talk about what that is and what people can do in that area.
Basically, think about both your house and then your whole yard, everything surrounding your house, and take that together and think about how fire might start somewhere, even if not on your house, and travel to your house. So it could be an ember lofts into a tree 100 yards away, and then there's what's called ladder fuel, on this tree. Ladder fuel meaning like smaller branches and limbs going up from the ground, and then there's tall grass or shrubs or whatever down below it that could then carry that fire into more trees, into more shrubs, and carry it to your home. The idea is, when we talk about the home ignition zone, is to make it so there's not this clear path for fire to burn from farther out to your house, and on the sort of envelope of your home itself, to make sure that your own home is pretty secure from things like lofting embers that could set it ablaze. Some of the bigger things are, don't have a wood roof that can ignite, so you might need a new roof.
And this is what's called home hardening, right? So there's sort of like another layer. So there's the stuff you can do in your yard, clearing brush, and then there's this next step of like actually changing the materials on your house.
Exactly. So on the home itself, you can change out your roof. That's really important. And I think I should also say a lot of these changes also have other benefits. So like a new roof isn't a bad idea for all kinds of reasons in a lot of older homes. Other changes like new windows can be good for energy efficiency. New siding can be beneficial as well. But other things to think about are the sort of openings into your house. So like soffits and vents that are often open, these places that could kind of suck in embers. Put 1/8 inch screen on those. Pretty simple, pretty cheap fix, but it goes a long way in sort of sealing up the exterior of your house. Other things to think about is your deck. If you have a wooden deck, there's a lot of vulnerability there, so you could rebuild with fire-resistant material. Make sure there's not fire-prone stuff underneath your deck either. Also, think about the area 5 to 10 feet away from your house. So if there's wood mulch there, if there's trees like hanging over your roof, you might have to part ways with those trees, or at least those limbs. You might have to replace that wood mulch with gravel. A wooden fence can sort of act like a snake and just whip fire right to the side of your house. So think about, that sort of 5-10 feet of a fence going up to your house. Maybe replace that with something metal or something that's not wood and going to burn right away. And as you move farther away, the things to do are less intensive, but it means, spacing out your trees. You might have to change the way you think about your landscape. You might have to cut down some trees, certainly thin trees, space things out more. And think about fuel breaks. So even things like building a little walking path in your yard, for example, could be a great way of just having a little barrier that keeps flames away.
That's great. There's a lot, actually. And I do want to say this isn't about making your home impervious to fire, right? Because that's pretty difficult, but it's about giving it a better chance of withstanding fire and helping the people that might be coming to defend your property if you're, in the case of having wildland firefighters do that, right?
That's absolutely right. It just gives your home a better shot of surviving. There's an image from Lahaina last year that went kind of viral after it happened, of a home, that the sole home that was surviving. And if you look at that house, a lot of the things I just spoke about had been done there, whether or not that was consciously for wildfire, but it sort of speaks to the real impact those practices can make. But also, we shouldn't rely on firefighters and expect firefighters to defend our property. But if a fire does come and firefighters are coming through the area and are trying to keep fires away from homes, which does happen, there are lots of cases where firefighters will just pass up a home if it's clearly dangerous, if there's clearly no hope of stopping the flame. Mm-hmm. But if you give them a chance and even give them a safe space, that can make a huge difference in what is done for your property when disaster does occur.
So this can feel like a lot of work, right? Which you acknowledge. The end of the day, it's one more thing to add to your list. You do provide some really great lists of how you can sort of start small and knock things off one by one, what you can do in an hour, an afternoon, or a weekend maybe. How have you found the time to do this kind of work on your own home?
I mean, I'm not perfect. We have a ton of work still to do here. It's interesting because having a house means there's just this endless sort of tally of stuff that's got to get done. And, putting this stuff into it, I think a lot of the things that are continuous is some of the maintenance work that can be done anyway, like things like clearing out your gutters. That's really important. Other things, bigger projects, are just the sort of things you need to think about in the long term, like replace your roof when it's time to replace your roof. Don't do it too early. And it's not all or nothing. Every little action you take can make a big difference. So don't feel bad for not having done everything you could possibly do. Don't feel bad for not having a perfectly fire resistant shell of your home or yard or whatever. But do, think creatively. Like at the same time that you're mowing your lawn, be like, oh, maybe that tree doesn't need to be here anymore. Or, just look at your landscape a little bit differently. Also, like, talk with neighbors. People are excited to help each other. It can become a community norm to have this work done. So there's some nonprofits and communities across the U.S. working on this stuff. And what a lot of people find is that, like, if there's some sign of this work being done, it can kind of go a long way to making it feel like this is a thing you should do in your community. In the same way that there's, like, if you live in an area with, say, black bears and you have bear-resistant garbage, as soon as you start seeing that, it's like, oh, maybe I should have that too. Mm-hmm. If you start seeing, like, a sign that says, hey, I replaced my roof, hey, I did all this work to make it fire resistant, that can make it seem like this is just something to be done in the community. And it becomes part of the sort of everyday nature of this sort of long tally of work you have to do on your home.
Nick Mott is a multimedia journalist and author of This is Wildfire, How to Protect Yourself, Your Home, and Your Community in the Age of Heat. Thank you so much for joining us on Climate One.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, Indigenous communities have long and nuanced practices to live in balance with wildfires. Now government officials are asking to learn from them.
It's been an opportunity for the Forest Service to align their authorities and their policies with that of the tribes, with that of the community.
That's up next when Climate One continues. Indigenous tribes have deep ancestral knowledge of how to live with and manage fire in their native lands. Frank Lake is a research ecologist and tribal liaison with the U.S. Forest Service. He's worked extensively in fire and worked to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into restoration ecology and forest management. Lake himself has American Indian, Mexican, and European ancestry. Before his long career began, he got a taste of fire's unpredictable nature while doing some intentional burning on his grandfather's property.
I was in high school. It was a cold, dry, full moon March night. And I was doing some burn piles and cleaning up. And I remember the gust came up and then it swept and it just went with the wind push going behind the woodshed and going down along the hill and sweeping across through the grass. And it was almost going to get down into other manzanita or the shrubs. And then went to the neighbor's yard or the driveway down below and didn't quite go into the yard. But it was quite the excitement as I was running through there. For me to kind of humbly have that experience from doing pile burning and cleaning up and reducing the fire danger around my grandfather's house, my mom's dad, there and at their property in the Sierra foothills outside of Sacramento near Jackson, California, that was really kind of, like, whoa, okay, that was humbling. But at the same time, it was also a place I was very much tied to kind of in my own California native traditions by doing a lot of hunting and gathering acorns there. Still a lot of the Northwest California traditions I still brought to the foothills when I finished high school down in Sacramento.
Yeah, it's quite a thing for an eighth grader, and it sounds like it worked out okay. Didn't hurt anyone or burn any structures, that fire that got behind you?
Even, we had done a lot of, like, what we talk about now being, fire reduction and keeping things cleaner on the woodshed and the other cabin that was there, the old cabin, and then the property boundaries around the power pole and the driveways. And so it pretty much just cleaned off about a nice, a little over half an acre area, maybe acre. And I was a little excited and kind of sheepishly telling my grandfather to wake up, like, Grandpa, this is what happened. But it's all cleaned up. It's all cleaned up now.
Wow. Okay. So you've been doing this for a while. And I'm curious, when you arrived to work at the Forest Service, the federal government, what was the level of understanding or appreciation of traditional ecological knowledge and cultural burning of forests?
At that time, there was definitely interest in prescribed fire for fire risk reduction and maybe wildlife habitat in the Southeast. But there was nothing really about cultural burning in the late 1990s. It wasn't even until the early 2000s that there became more of an emergent part around traditional ecological knowledge and traditional uses of fire. Robin Kimmerer, she asked me at the time, she was doing her sabbatical at Oregon State University. Her and I wrote together, Maintaining the Mosaics, an article for the Journal of Forestry. That's really gone a long ways now since then. But that was really kind of my eye-opening in kind of the academic to traditional ecological knowledge and fire, writing that article with Robin that really began to bring this more front and center. And for other academics and agency managers begin to think and consider the implications of historical fire regimes, particularly influenced by Indigenous fire management and cultural burning or working with tribes on fire management today. And that was all in the early 2000s.
Right, because for 100 years, the Forest Service was about protecting timber, which was then sold. It was protecting a economic asset, and that led to the suppression of burning, Smokey the Bear that we all learned growing up, right? So this seems to be what you're saying. Around the early 2000s, there was a shift from protecting board feet and timber production to other ways of thinking about the forest. Is that right?
Yes, and also prominently here in Northwest California and the Pacific Northwest was the Northwest Forest Plan under President Clinton. So in 1994, there was a large shift in forest policy that began to look at late successional reserves, riparian reserves, the aquatic conservation strategy, the matrix lands where you'd be managing for more timber volume. And so that shift regionally really began to get the attention. And I think, there was an interesting part of it, again, about the emergence of traditional ecological knowledge that was coming into informing those discussions, a growing interest in tribal consultation or learning and working with tribes.
You went into work for this big agency responsible for Smokey the Bear and putting out every fire, and fire's bad. We got to minimize it. What did your Indigenous friends say when you went to go to this big agency that had this totally different approach to fire that was very different than your Indigenous heritage?
Well, actually, we'd have to go back to when I was a child growing up here in Northwest California on the Six Rivers National Forest and Klamath National Forest. They call it the GO Road, the Gasquet for G, the Orleans O Road. It was going from the coast to the interior, and that was going through the very sacred high country, what is now the Siskiyou Wilderness area of those national forests. That was a very sacred place to us. My father was training and learning from elders. I was taken along that. So I grew up within that controversy of the Forest Service. I remember being with my Crook grandfather in a horse trailer and getting cedar trees to be able to build dance houses and other ceremonial structures and having run-ins of law enforcement. I remember the fire suppression policy being front and center within the tribal community who lamented the changes in the forest, that there was less foods, there was less habitat for the wildlife and hunting opportunity, less batch create material, that you had to wait for lightning to strike an area, then often those fires were suppressed. And so really, as a child growing up here in Northwest California, it was kind of a controversial and contentious relationship with the Forest Service, living in a fire-prone area, dependent upon fire-adapted species and being a fire-dependent culture. That really was all, for me, really formulated through that spiritual and cultural experiences and as part of a tribal community who often was at odds with the Forest Service management, particularly around timber and fire suppression. And as I got older, I thought, well, if you're working internally, you can change the system. But there also was a lot of, I think, why aren't you going to work for the tribe, or why are you deciding to work for the Forest Service? There was some of that animosity or some of those comments as well when I was a younger starting professional.
Right. So it sounds like you went inside because you thought you could change something big and important. Is that why you overcame those criticisms or from your community to try to go work for
the colonial agency? I guess, but at the same time, to the agency's credit, there was a lot of diversity hire. So I came in as part of a diversity minority recruitment into the management side when I was wrapping up my coursework at Oregon State University, and moved back to California to finish my graduate work here on the Klamath River with the basket weavers and the tribal community. The Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station, the station director then, Jim Siddell, used to know me from the fisheries work as a scientist up in the Northwest Coast and brought me in. And, people like that in key leadership positions saw something in me and really nurtured me. So I owe it to those early station director and leadership who were also following and looking at opportunities for diversity hire to really promote me and to encourage me to retain me within the system, particularly in the research side of it.
And what sort of changes have you seen inside since you've been in that big, called it, colonial agency in its approach to fire?
Yeah, really, over the last 20 years is a change in understanding, especially with climate-induced or anthropogenic change on our systems, the increase in fuel loading or the factors of risk and vulnerability within our Western forest, is that we have to learn to live with wildfire and documenting tribal uses of fire and how landscapes have changed as a result of the lack of fire and tribal stewardship for fire use has brought together a body of science and knowledge that now we're incorporating into our management decisions. And so I've been fortunate to bring together through these other top scientific teams a lot of information that informs us about the past fire regimes, particularly cultural uses of fire. And if those are things we want to emulate today, then we need to work with tribes and reinstate that. And particularly as a broader society, how do we learn to live with wildfire? And some have a little bit of healthy fear, but also reverence for it in a way that, we're going to be a fire smart or fire wise society.
So let's talk about an example of where that has been done. I think it's called the Western Klamath Restoration Project.
Yeah, the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. So I've been involved with them as part of a core team member, and I'm the Forest Service coordinating scientist assigned to the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. The Karuk tribe is a co-lead, also there with the local National Forest Service, the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council, and the Salmon River Restoration Council, often working in the summer times with the agency archaeologists, the incident management teams, the local tribes, their heritage consultants and elders and so when you ask what's changed, it's been an opportunity for the Forest Service to align their authorities and their policies with that of the tribes, with that of the community, to find alignment between our conservation principles, say for threatened and endangered species, that of heritage and cultural resources, and then also looking at rural livelihoods and the economies through not necessarily disaster economies, as we talk about boom and bust cycles of like working on fires and then, heavy extraction, but really looking at more of a restoration economy where we restore. And part of that project is to restore the drought tolerant, fire adapted vegetation of cultural and ecological importance.
So you've went into the Forest Service. There's been some changes and openness toward accepting Indigenous burning practices. Is it ever tiresome to bear the burden of teaching white people, guys like me, how to talking about landscape burning in a beneficial way? Do you ever feel that way inside the Forest Service?
I feel it not only inside the Forest Service, but with a lot of my academic colleagues. I'm actually writing on a writing team right now where we're part of Respectful Narratives. And that's one of the issues that I address is it's called the culture or minority tax. It's really where you're the one, and this stems back to even when I was younger in my academic training, teaching. I would hear professors or other scientists make accusations or assumptions that were beyond our scientific understanding about Indigenous influences on forest or fire regimes and have to correct them. And then they feel challenged, and there's a bit of settler or colonial fragility and being like, well, you are out of bounds on your assumptions. To be more culturally inclusive and accurate, this is the tribal history and perspective or implications of tribal stewardship or management on the system that you're supposed to be an expert in. And so when I think about, now the big emphasis on terrestrial ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge and, the recognition to work with tribes as partners, it's great. But there's a lot of training that needs to happen in cultural competency. Most importantly, there needs to be a lot of reconciliation about the history and the legacy of colonization and settlement that affect tribal communities. And then to come up in a way where you can foster allies who are open to hearing that, but not necessarily feel blamed or accountable for that, but how they might be perpetuating some colonial bias even in their approaches. I'll give you an example. It's like, there's been this colonial myth that there's natural ecological processes that we're going to help restore and emulate. But yet, when you look back through a lot of our interdisciplinary studies, we've shown for millennia and across generations, Indigenous people have been influential factors on these ecosystems and habitats for a long time. So once we recognize that as part of our reconciliation, once we, acknowledge the contribution of Indigenous influence or impact on these ecosystems, and those are parts of the things we want to emulate or restore, then we should be working with tribes to respectfully engage them as being not only local beneficiaries, but also the society as a co-beneficiary of that process.
Right. So looking ahead in terms of healing and wildfire management, what would you like to see as we're seeing more impacts from climate disruption?
Well, for many tribes, fire is considered medicine, and tribes have always adapted to the effects of climate change. We've also have that in the bodies of science and Indigenous histories. So I think part of it is how can we work with our Indigenous partners to learn the ways to go from philosophical teachings that are important about our understanding of the environment, of fire, how climate's affecting us, and then how we actualize that or operationalize that through our partnerships on the ground, where we choose to do the work, how we do the work, and how we are co-beneficiaries of that work. The perspective that it was all natural or that it was wilderness or a place that was unaffected by Indigenous people historically. We say, oh, look at those. We want to restore oak woodlands and grassland systems. Well, yet we know that those were orchards for acorns, as being an acorn-dependent, culture, and having acorns and grasslands where you have your Indian potatoes or a lot of your lilies and bulbs and medicines, like those were anthropogenically or tribally maintained across millennia for generations. So we're not restoring oak woodlands. We're helping restore orchards. We're helping restore, the places that many tribal people consider their hardware store, their supermarket, their pharmacy, and their sacred places as churches, and to be able to reduce the negative impacts of climate, whether it's drought, stress on forest, and from wildfire.
I love that. Going to take that away. Fire as medicine and oak lands as pharmacies and convenience stores, and looking at it in a new light. And thank you, Frank, for talking about a changing relationship with fire and how we can go forward together. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That was Frank Lake, research ecologist and tribal liaison for the U.S. Forest Service. And that's our show. Thanks for listening. This episode was supported through the Wildfire Strategies Program of Resources Legacy Fund. And if you'd like to hear more about how California is preparing for and managing wildfires, check out our special podcast drop on Monday, June 10th, featuring our conversation with Wade Crowfoot, California's Natural Resources Secretary. You'll find it in our regular Climate One podcast feed.
Brad Marshland is our senior producer. Our managing director is Jenny Park. Ariana Brocious is co-host, editor, and producer. Austin Colon is producer and editor. Megan Basilia is our producer and production manager. Wency Shada is our development manager. Our communications manager is Ben Testani. Jenny Lawton is consulting producer. Our theme music was composed by George Young. Gloria Duffy and Philip Yun are co-CEOs of the Commonwealth Club World Affairs, the nonprofit and nonpartisan forum where our program originates. I'm Greg Dalton.